Hello and welcome to Pickleball Therapy, the podcast dedicated to your pickleball improvement, more specifically, the podcast dedicated to your pickleball mind. I am your host of this weekly podcast, Tony Roig. It is a pleasure to be with you this week and every week, bringing you content to help you with that part of the game that is sometimes overlooked, your mind. A part of you that will radically improve how you play pickleball, how you feel when you play pickleball, and not just pickleball, also how you feel throughout life. And this week, what I want to talk about is I want to talk about competition. I want to reframe how we think about competition so that we can see what's really happening out there and how we can use that information in terms of how we feel about what's happened during a contest, and also how we can view it in terms of our trajectory, our journey as pickleball players. Before we dive into that, a couple of housekeeping notes. Number one, in the next few months, you may see some changes to the structure and delivery of the podcast. The content of the podcast will remain this content, the content that you've come to hopefully enjoy and be beneficial to you. And I'm still going to be the host of the podcast, but there are some changes that we're making to the podcast to help us continue to grow the podcast. And then the second point of housekeeping is that we have our Better Pickleball Academy subscription model launching in a couple of weeks. So if you're on an email list, which I assume if you listen to this podcast you are, you will get notified by email. Be on the lookout for that. If you are not on the email, you can join the email at betterpickleball.com and simply subscribe to the email. All right, let's talk about competition and how we view it and what is, I would submit to you, a more beneficial way of thinking about it. So the way that we view a pickleball game is it's a contest between us and our partner against two other opponents, and then there's a result, right? So you have the input in the situation is the pickleball game, right? That's going on. The factors that affect the outcome of the game are us, our partner, and our two opponents. And so you kind of shake that all up, and at the end you have either we won the game or we lost the game. And what we end up doing is we end up looking at it in terms of we lost to our opponents, or we beat our opponents, or our partner did this or our partner did that, things like that. What I'm going to submit to you or suggest to you is that what's really happening when you play pickleball is it's really a contest of you against you. Now, against there is not meant to be like any kind of a negative fight kind of a thing. It's simply a fact that when you're playing pickleball, it's really, at the end of the day, a contest where you are testing yourself against yourself. And to help explain that, let's use an analogy / metaphor. By now, you probably know I don't distinguish between those two because I can't remember which one's which. So what we're going to do is we're going to use an analogy metaphor where we're going to go into a laboratory and we're going to test the impact of 4 factors on the outcome, on the results, given the inputs that are put into them. So we're going to have our inputs go in, we have 4 factors, and we have our output. Now we want to know how factor A of the 4 factors, A, B, C, and D. So I have factor A, factor B, factor C, factor D. I want to know how factor A impacts the results, right? Based on the inputs that we're putting in there. If I allow all 4 factors to run free, in other words, to have an impact on the results, I cannot tell how factor A impacted the results, right? Because it could have been that if the results were, say, positive, it might have been B, it might have been D, it might have been a combination of some A and some C, or some of A, B, C, and D. I can't tell. So the only way to isolate factor A and the impact of factor A in this lab experiment is to restrict factors B, C, and D. Now, a quick side note here in case you're either in science or you remember your science well. Normally, the term that's used for that is I want to control for B, C, and D, and let A run free. The reason I'm using the term control here is because I'm going to come back to the term control later and talk about it in terms of our control, right? So I don't want to mix those words up. So we're going to use the term restrict here. So going back to the experiment, I have my 4 factors. I'm going to restrict B, C, and D, and I'm going to allow factor A to run free, to basically be the only factor that's a variable. And then I can apply inputs into my experiment. I have my output, and then I know that the output was the result of factor A's influence on the inputs, or the inputs acting on factor A will give me my output. When we play pickleball, it is going to be the same situation where we have 4 factors. Okay, we have factor A, that's going to be us, you, if you want to think about it that way. So factor A is our person. Factor B is going to be our partner. Then you have factors C and D. Those are our opponents, our 2 players across the net. So we're on a pickleball court playing a pickleball game. We have 4 factors. The input in a pickleball game is going to be the game, the rules, the ball, the wind conditions, all the things that are happening. All the things that go into playing a pickleball game. The court size, which is a standard, but so you have a court size, you have the court conditions, all those things. Those are our inputs. Then you have the 4 factors, A, B, C, and D, and then you have an output. And the output here is win the game or lose the game. And what you want to think about is you want to think about the fact that if you want to know how well you did or how much influence you had on the inputs in order to get the output, whether it's a win or a loss, you have to restrict B, C, and D. In other words, the only way you can know for sure whether you had a good day or a bad day, or whether the win was because of you or the loss was because of you, is to control or restrict B, C, and D. So let me run through some scores so you get the idea of a better sense of the idea I'm talking about here. So let's assume that you played 4 games in a row, and the score of the games are: first game you lost 5-11, second game you lost 9-11. Third game you won 11-9, and the fourth game you won 11-5. So you go from a 5-11 loss to a 9-11 loss, tighter, right? Better result in terms of being closer. Then you flipped it, and now you won 11-9, and then the last game you won pretty decisively 11-5. Okay? If you think about it in terms of everybody on the court, in other words, if you allow for A, B, C, and D to be variable, then what does that? How can you deduce anything from those scores? Okay. In other words, when you went from 5-11 to 9-11 to 11-9 to 11-5, was that because of your play, or was that factor B, or was that your opponent's factors C and D? You have no way of knowing, right? Whether it was you or your opponents or your partner who were the actual causes of some or all of those results, including the trend that you see there. Now let's go back to the lab experiment and restrict for B, C, and D. So I'm going to restrict B, C, and D. We're going to make your partner and your opponents constants. And what that means is they're going to play identical every time. They're going to make the same basic decisions. They're going to play the same way every single game. If we could do that, and we had the scores of 5-11, 9-11, 11-9, 11-5, first we would know that all of those scores are the result of your play as factor A, right? So it's you as factor A are the cause of all those scores. The second thing we'd be able to tell is that you were playing better over the course of those games, because you went from a loss of 5-11 to a win of 11-5, and the 2 nines in the middle, right? But you basically went from losing, not that great, to losing pretty well, to winning pretty tight, to winning really well. And if factors B, C, and D are restricted, right, or constants, then the only difference in those games and in those scores is you as factor A. Now, in the real world, we can't do that. Right? In the real world, we can't make B, C, and D constant. That's just not how the real world works. But what we can do is we can say the only thing that matters, the only thing that I can control, and this is where the term control comes back in and the way I want to use it for this podcast. The only thing that I can control is what? Factor A. The only thing I can control is me and my play. Now, I can't look at the results of the game to determine how I played. You see? That's the beauty of thinking about it this way. The results of the game are a result of a combination of A, B, C, and D, right? All those factors played into the outcome of the game, the result, the win or the loss, and the score, whatever it was, a blowout by us, a blowout by them, or a tight game. That is all dictated by 4 factors, all working in sync, right? Or not in sync, but at the same time. They all have an effect on the result. Because that's the world that we live in, it doesn't make sense to look at the result and then impute that result to one factor, factor A, or ourselves, right? So instead of viewing the result and saying that's because of me or something I could have done better, the only thing that makes sense is evaluating how factor A did, that's you, relative to what? Relative to what factor A can do. Okay, in other words, what is it that what are you able to do? And within that, there's some nuance, right? In sense of if you're having a bad day, okay, you didn't get good sleep last night, you have something going on with your family, whatever it is, you don't feel well physically, any of those things. Well, you can't expect that you're going to play at your baseline level or at your top level if you're not in tip-top shape, right? So you would factor that in there. Let's assume that you're in great, everything's fantastic, everything's great, you're focused, everything's wonderful. Even there, you still have a baseline where you say to yourself, I'm a human being, right? I'm a human being, so I'm going to make mistakes when I play. I'm going to make silly decisions. I'm going to do all sorts of things that I wish I had done otherwise, or in a perfect world I could have done otherwise, because we're human. So you have your baseline in any event, and so you want to evaluate factor A, you, relative to factor A. So every time that you go out to play, it's not a contest where you're evaluating the results. It's not you're not attributing the results to you. All you're attributing to you is how you did relative to you, relative to your baseline, relative to what you're able to do, relative to what you can bring that day to the court, and nothing else. Not extrapolating from the scores onto you as a player. Because that, as you've seen, makes no sense. Because you cannot control factors B, C, and D. You cannot restrict, you cannot make constant factors B, C, and D. B, C, and D are going to run free. They're going to go up and down, play better, play worse as games move along. And in that kind of a world, in that kind of environment, which is the real environment that we inhabit, it only makes sense to evaluate factor A relative to what factor A can do. And what that does is then it makes the pickleball contest about how you perform relative to how you can perform, with the caveat of, or not the caveat, but the qualifier of as well as you can under your current circumstances. So this approach then allows you some peace of mind, because you don't need to worry about the score, because there's 3 other factors that you cannot control that impact the score. And it also helps you in terms of your development as a player, because the fact that maybe you went from, let's say you started with a winning streak that day and ended up losing 3 games at the end, is not indicative of anything, is not indicative necessarily of your play or of your improvement as a player. what you need to do is look at your play and determine whether your play is improving or not improving during a session and also over time. As an example, if you're working on a specific part of your game, say you're inside the latest, you're one of the students inside our latest TPS class, right? Pickleball system class, and you're focusing on your punch volley, okay? In that situation, at the end of a game, if you want to think about how did I do that game, focus on what? Focus on how you were hitting your punch volleys, if that's what you're focused on. Knowing that the better that I hit my punch volleys, the better I'm going to play. The better I'm going to play, the better my factor A, is going to have, the more positive impact my factor A is going to have on the results of the game. Doesn't mean we're going to win, but everything that I do inside my factor, the only one I can control, to improve my play, the best chance I give our team of being successful in that contest. So hopefully this way of thinking about it, might resonate with you and give you a way of framing your impact on the game or lack of control over the result of a game, and focus you on the areas over which you have actual control, which is your play and your performance, again, with the qualifier of within the best that you can do under your circumstances that day. I hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. These sorts of messages, these sorts of thoughts take some time to sink in sometimes or to make an effect. But I can assure you that the cumulative effect of these conversations that we have, of these concepts that we share, can have a definite positive impact on your approach to the game, on your performance as a player, how you feel as a player, and also you can then take these ideas and then apply them in your life at large, including the one we talked about today. If you enjoyed the podcast, please consider taking a moment to rate and review it. And as always, please share it with your friends. Remember, if you enjoyed the podcast, they probably will too. I hope you have a great week, and I'll see you next week on a regular episode of Pickleball Therapy. Be well.